Today, we're diving deep into a major study from the Journal of the American Medical Association. It looks at something many of us do every day, drink coffee and tea, and connects it to our long-term brain health. So let's get right into the evidence. For years, we've heard these hints and whispers that they might be good for us. But the real question, the big one, is this. Can our daily cup of coffee or tea actually protect our brains against dementia? Well, this new study gives us one of the clearest answers we've ever had. And just so you know where this is all coming from, the source for this whole analysis is a huge prospective cohort study by Zhang and his colleagues. The fact that it was published in a top-tier journal like JAMA, well, that means the medical community takes these findings very, very seriously. So here's how we're going to break it all down. We're going to follow the paper's own structure, which is really logical. We'll start with the background, why they did the study. Then we'll get into the methods, the key results, look at the dosage, and finally wrap up with the conclusion and the clinical message. Okay, first things first. Why was a study like this even needed? What was the big unanswered question that scientists were trying to figure out? Well, the truth is, the gap in our knowledge was pretty significant. A lot of the older data was contradictory, kind of all over the place. And most studies couldn't answer one critical question. If there's a benefit, is it coming from the caffeine itself? Or is it from other things in coffee and tea, like polyphenols or antioxidants? The main goal here was to finally separate the effects of caffeinated versus decaf to try and pinpoint what's really doing the work. So to tackle that huge question, the researchers needed a really powerful study design, and boy did they have one. Let's just take a look at the sheer scale of this thing. First, the number of people. The study included this massive group of over 131,000 participants. A number that big gives you incredible statistical power. And they didn't just track them for a little while. They followed these people for up to 43 years. That is absolutely crucial when you're studying a disease like dementia, which can take decades to develop. You put all that together, all those people over all those years, and it adds up to more than 4.3 million person-years of data. The sheer volume here is what allows the findings to be so precise and so reliable. So these incredible numbers aren't just pulled out of thin air. They come from two of the most respected, long-running studies in medical history, the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And they kept the data fresh, updating everyone's dietary habits every few years to make sure it was accurate over the long haul. Okay, so that's the setup, a powerful long-term study. Now for the main event. What did this massive investigation actually reveal? Let's get into the core findings. And here it is, the headline result for caffeinated coffee. You'll see this term, hazard ratio, or HR. What does 0.82 mean? Well, it means that when you compare the people who drank the most coffee to those who drank the least, they had a statistically significant 18% lower risk of developing dementia. The graph here shows it perfectly, that clear downward trend as intake goes up. And what's really amazing is that the findings for tea drinkers were almost identical. They also had a protective association with a hazard ratio of 0.86. This kind of consistency is exactly what scientists look for. It suggests there's a real effect here, probably from a component that both drinks share. Okay, this slide is the real clincher. This is where it all clicks into place. On the left, you see that protective effect from caffeinated coffee we just talked about. But look at the right, that's decaf. The line is totally flat. A hazard ratio right around 1.0 means nothing. No association, no benefit, no harm. The interpretation here is just crystal clear. The fact that decaf has no effect strongly suggests that caffeine itself is the key ingredient providing that neuroprotection. So if caffeine is the hero of the story, the next obvious question is, how much is the right amount? And were there any other benefits they found? Let's dig into the dose response and the other findings. See, the researchers didn't just stop at yes or no. They wanted to know how much is best. This graph, it's called a dose-response curve, shows that as caffeine intake goes up, dementia risk drops, but then it starts to level off. This tells us there's a sweet spot, a point where you get the maximum benefit. And here are the practical numbers for that sweet spot. The lowest risk for dementia was seen in people drinking about 2 to 3 cups of caffeinated coffee a day, or maybe 1 to 2 cups of tea. All in all, that comes out to a total of around 300 milligrams of caffeine per day. Interestingly, going beyond that didn't seem to add any extra protection. The study also looked beyond dementia and tested actual cognitive function. And on these objective tests, the higher caffeine consumers just scored better.
Now, to put that into perspective, the difference in their scores was about the same as being zero point 0.6 years younger in cognitive age. It's a modest effect for sure, but it was statistically significant.
You might be wondering, does this apply to everyone? Well, the findings were incredibly robust. This protective link was seen even in people who carry the ApoE4 gene, which is a major genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's. And here's something really interesting. The effect was even stronger in people younger than 75, which might suggest that starting these habits earlier in life gives you the biggest bang for your buck.
All right, let's pull all of this incredible information together and boil it down to a clear conclusion and a practical clinical message.
Now, before we go any further, it's absolutely crucial to talk about a study's limitations. Good science is always honest about what it can and can't say. This was an observational study, which means it shows a very strong link, an association, but it can't prove that coffee causes the lower risk. There's always a chance that other unmeasured lifestyle factors are at play, and the data was self-reported. But for answering this kind of long-term question, this is pretty much the strongest type of evidence you can get. So, after all that, what is the final clinical take-home message from this landmark paper? Well, it really comes down to 4 key points. First, caffeinated coffee and tea are strongly linked to a lower risk of dementia. Second, the evidence points a very clear finger directly at caffeine as being the key protective ingredient. Third, moderation is key. The sweet spot is right around 2 to 3 cups of coffee or 1 to 2 cups of tea per day. And finally, these benefits seem to apply to a very broad range of people, regardless of their genetic risk. This study really gives us some of the most solid evidence we have to date on how our simple daily drink choices could shape the future health of our brains.